7:06. Welcome and thank you for joining us tonight. This is the Business Book Club's 44th event, and it's our third online event. Due to what's happening at the moment, we've been forced to go online, which is not a bad thing because we are now able to actually reach people in other geographical areas. So it's been quite a blessing as well, so we can reach some more people. So my name is Bronwyn, and I've been working with the Business Book Club for almost 3 years now, and I've loved seeing how this initiative has inspired people and helped so many people all over South Africa. The Business Book Club was started in 2017 and with the purpose of sharing knowledge, because what is the point of knowledge if we keep it to ourselves? So we are a non-profit organization, and we interview a different South African author every single month so that people can learn, grow, and share in life and in business. And we've also collected over 7,000 secondhand books that we have now, through our events, which we've distributed to underprivileged areas all over South Africa. So it's really picking up and it's really doing well, and we absolutely love what we do. So at the end of the conversation tonight, we are going to open up a question and answer section. If you look at the bottom right of your screen, you'll be able to ask any question, and we will pose the questions to the author for you, and you'll be able to have them answered. So watch out for that later on and get your questions ready ahead of time. If you already have questions ready, then that's perfect, but we will announce when we're going to open it. Okay, so I would like to introduce you to the man behind it all, who started this initiative in April 2017. He is extremely passionate about helping people succeed personally and in business. And he's also a next level master coach. And he has helped more than 100 CEOs and other leaders to take their businesses and their lives to the next level, and also more than double their company revenues. He is completely and truly dedicated to making a difference in people's lives. So I'd like to now hand you over to the founder and the CEO of the Business Book Club, Mr. Jacques Bellerman.
There we go, Elaine. Thank you so much for rectifying me on that. That was me on mute talking away. Thank goodness for people that actually do remind you. So thank you for that. Okay, so here we go again. Thank you, Bronwyn, for that great introduction. Also, thank you for everything that you do behind the scenes. You're our master of ceremonies, our producer, our supporter, and helping us making all of this happen. So thank you so much for that. Sharing knowledge, ladies and gentlemen, is what the Business Book Club is about. And tonight, we have a brilliant, excellent, and amazing author, Wandile Sihlobo. And I'd like to introduce you to him. Wandile is an economist, an agricultural economist. He is currently the chief economist of the Agricultural Business Chamber of South Africa. He is also, very interestingly, a member of the South African President Cyril Ramaphosa's Economic Advisory Council. So this is a man that gets close to the ears of our president, advising them on policies on such an important topic as land reform, which we are going to talk about. And share some knowledge. But not only that, he's also a columnist for the Business Day, the Daily Maverick. He's a member of Stats SA. He's got a master's degree in the science, a Master of Science degree in agricultural economics from the University of Stellenbosch. This is a man with extreme amounts of knowledge. He's been around the block in terms of understanding this part of our country. He's done a massive amount of research. Wandile, welcome to the Versus Book Club. It is lovely to have you here this evening.
Now, thank you so much, Jacques, for that kind introduction, and also for having me on at the Business Book Club. I appreciate this opportunity. Thank you.
Wandile, it's an absolute pleasure. Here at the Business Book Club, it's about sharing knowledge and sharing knowledge through experts like yourself, so that our audience can walk away tonight. You know, that is our mission, is that they can walk away tonight with something that they didn't know. Because why else would they spend the time with us in the comfort of their homes? Maybe they're still at the office, or maybe they're traveling, wherever they are. Thank you very much for joining us. And please feel free, ladies and gentlemen, we can see on the side, we can see the chat box. We can see the questions that are being asked, so please join our conversation. Wandile and I will pick that up as we go along, and we will share the knowledge with you as much as we can. And remember, you don't know what you don't know until you've asked the question. And there's nothing such as a dumb question, right?
Absolutely.
Excellent. Wandile, so let's start off with your book, Finding Common Ground. A very interesting topic. But who did you write this book for? Who did you have in mind when you sat down and put this book together? Who did you have in mind should pick it up and read it?
Yeah, I think, Jack, it's on different levels. The book per se, one would say holistically, it is a book for every South African to look at it. But I think depending on what perspective you are approaching the book from, and you can get certain messages on that. Firstly, I think for general South Africans who are not into the agricultural sector on their day-to-day lives, in this book, they get to gain insight about how is the sector actually performing, what are some of the things that we think about, what are some of the opportunities that are in the sector, what contribution does it make to our lives, but also to the economy, and also some of the intricacies that are not covered on a day-to-day news or events of some sort. But I think also if you are in the sector, there are certain messages that come in, particularly in chapters that focus on policy matters. There's certain messages which I try to tease out, certain options that I try to put out. Either you are dealing with trade policy, or you are dealing with land reform policy, or you are looking at development broadly. There are those key messages that are in there. So I think even if you are a policymaker, you do look at the book and also see some of the other options around these themes that I've put out here. Either it's on trade, you're on land reform, you think about development, you think about even new crops like cannabis. There's a lot of issues to try to tease out here. So the book holistically, it's a book for all South Africans to really look at it. And even if you're outside South Africa, I'd say it tries to paint a picture of what is it the South African agriculture and the agri-economy actually looking like.
Wandile, I guess that's extremely important what you're saying there. And for me, I thought about your topic, agriculture, and I thought, initially when we set up this interview, I thought, well, sure, are we going to have a bunch of farmers, on a call? But then I realized that, as South Africans, we need to become extremely involved in our country, on all levels. And, what you unpack in the book for us is the importance of the agricultural economy for the sustainability of our country. And for us to understand that is extremely important, to understand where it is that we can help and contribute to this. Because in a big way, the future of South Africa hinges on that. And we're going to dive into that. I mean, if I just look at how you've set out this book, you're talking about land reform, which is a very sensitive topic in many cases. You're talking about the employment in the agricultural sector. You're talking about trade and leadership and development, and the cannabis topic, I think, is going to be very interesting. And hopefully, one or two things will come out of that. And then also about Africa. And hopefully we'll get some questions relating to that and our involvement in Africa. But first share with me or with our audience tonight is when you look at South Africa, and we know that this is a topic that a lot of people are concerned about. Let's be realistic about that. A lot of people have been concerned, and a lot of people have made major decisions in their lives based on their concern about land reform. In your book, you explain that you are optimistic about the future. Please, could you just share a bit more detail with our audience tonight, why they should be listening and why they should be optimistic about the future, especially regarding the subject of land reform?
Yeah, I mean, Jack, we finished writing the book, I think around about December last year. And at the time, obviously in China, there was starting to be all of the talk about the pandemic, but the coronavirus at the time. But we didn't envisage that this will be a global pandemic to be at the scale that it is in. And now that we are in this new world, and then the book is out at this place, it comes in South Africa, where at a time where we are thinking, we're saying, okay, we are dealing with the pandemic, but when all is said and done and we have the vaccine, we will need to grow the economies. And from that perspective, we are looking at various sectors on what they could offer, both in terms of growth and also on employment opportunities, which is where I think that the book also, even in a context of today, it sits well. Because in the story of agricultural growth and agricultural development, it places us on what we should be focusing on, which areas on a micro perspective should we be targeting in South Africa, and what should we be doing in those areas. The Eastern Seaboard Belt, for example, starting from Eastern Cape, KZN, up to Limpopo, those are the growth frontiers for agriculture in South Africa. In terms of investment, expansion, we should be focusing on those areas. Now, in terms of optimism, which I was expressing, particularly when one was looking at the land story, we spent a great deal of time, I'd say past 2 years, dealing with the issue of possibly expropriation without compensation. While say at the face value of it, one can say this is controversial, difficult, raises many emotions, but it also opened a necessary debate to really look at land reform on its own, to say, how are we progressing? What should we be changing? And also force even people that held very different views about land reform in South Africa to really meet in one place and have a conversation. And I think that conversation was necessary. But obviously, the expropriation or widespread expropriation without compensation across the country is, as I say in the book, not a desired policy approach, but I think the discussion that we've had last year and forced us to actually be able to confront some of the issues that we were not willing to do so. Now, the optimism is drawn in part from that, but also in part that the policymakers and even people from various corners of society in South Africa, they are increasingly becoming aware of the dangers of some of the aspirations we might have had before we went to the discussion, but also aware of the opportunities that lie ahead, and how agriculture could actually be even helping us in terms of growth, in terms of opportunities. And I think now, as we look to the post-COVID-19 world, this will be become more critical. And obviously, the policies around land reform, these are some of the things that will continue to be discussed. But I think being in a country where we need outside investment and even investment from some of the local businesses, we will be much more careful about any policies that might drive investment away. And that's the point that I'm even sensing from the policymakers.
Okay, so what in your mind is the perfect solution for this whole land reform debate? How do you think, what do we need to do to solve that for a better future for South Africa?
I mean, Jack, there is no a perfect solution that I could put in place, because I mean the land reform is in South Africa is having many sides of it. In the book, I look at it largely from an economic perspective, but there is also an emotional perspective that is linked to the history of the country that needs to be confronted. There's a social perspective that it needs to be considered as we move in that discussion. But for the benefit of uniting the country and still growing, we will need to be cognizant about how we move in all of those worlds. And what I'm putting down in the book is really saying, look, expropriation or compensation per se, step back a little bit onto that. The first step that you need to do is to say, okay, how much land supply do we have on the state side? How do we first make sure that we allocate that to people to be able to use it productively, follow through with some set of support? Thereafter, which is what is on the book, look at some of the other principles and methods that you can use without actually driving away investments, given that we are in a capital-intensive sector in South Africa. So you need that money to get agriculture going. And that's where the aspects of a land reform fund, which I'm putting on the table there, to say you can start this fund, get money from various corners of South Africa, which we articulate in a book, then you buy some land in the market. But when you buy that land in the market, you might not be like the previous olden day where you were going at a market rate, because people like, again, you listen to guys like Tembeka Nzukai Toby, Bulelwa Mabasa, and many other guys on the lawyers, they say we're not compelled to go from that in that way from a legal perspective, but rather we could come up with some more meaningful ways of acquiring a land. Consider that. Thereafter, obviously, land donation policy, some putting on the table that could be considered. And I think that we need to use all of those options before thinking about any other thing that might lead, such as the expropriation
of land. Okay, so I'm gonna talk about this in very simple terms, so that I can also understand it. How much land in South Africa is not being used? In other words, is dormant.
There isn't much data, Jack, that gives us a sense onto that in South Africa. Because even with the ones that is used by the farmers, there's usually what they called you leave fallow land. You would plant certain portions of land this year, and then you would leave those on the next year, so that the process of preserving your land and the soil fertility takes in place there. And I mean, even land reform per se on its own, we don't have good data in South Africa about what's actually happening, even on who owns what. In the book, for example, you have the numbers that I offer there, which is from me and some of my colleagues at Stellenbosch University. But if you talk to government, they will say 9%, while we say 21% of the land has been transferred. You look at Agri-SA, which came up with their own land audit, they also having their own view. So the issue of improving land statistics is one of the things that it remains priority.
Yeah, because as we know in business, to make good decisions, you need good data. So when you don't have good data, your decision-making abilities are impaired. But be it as it may, I mean, it's not a perfect environment. But I would assume that the first thing to do is to go and use and farm land that hasn't been used or hasn't been used in the appropriate ways, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole point that we're looking at. And I mean, if you talk now to the lawmakers, there is roughly about 9 million hectares of land or so that the state can go around and utilizing that. But we should be conscious also of not saying focus on that 9 million hectares, leave everything else. Land reform will have to happen, but it's just that the methods of doing that, that's where we need to be cognizant about what methods to do that. But before you even embark full speed onto that, you need to make sure that that 9 million hectares is utilized productively, particularly at this time where we need growth and we need jobs. And I think that's the discussion that if you people in agriculture or agro-processing, they'll tell you about these master plans that are currently being developed as part of what will be the package for the post-COVID-19 economy. And I think that those master plans needs to be cognizant of these facts and try to make sure that we utilize as best as we can some of the pockets of land that is underutilized in the country. But I think, Jack, to close this particular point, one of the things that we should be cognizant of is also not to agriculturize the whole land reform, because the issue of housing, industrial side, is one of the other important components of land reform. But over the years, we've tried, when we think about land reform, to only think about agriculture, but I think it's much more wider. And policymakers will need to have that appreciation now going forward.
Of that, yeah, but I guess it's, the question is about poverty and alleviating poverty, and like you've said in your book, that strategically, agriculture plays a big and important role in alleviating some of the poverty, especially in the rural areas. But I guess, of that 9 million, Wandile, where is the biggest portion of property available? Is that in the Eastern Cape? Is it there?
Yeah, I mean, the Eastern Seaboard, that's the area at which you can still have some good room to go, because that now includes, and I mean, it comes in very well in a sense that if you look at which provinces are higher unemployment provinces in South Africa, with higher levels of poverty also, you really come up with higher poverty with about 3 provinces at the top. Your Eastern Cape, your KZN, and your Limpopo sits at the top. And when you look at some of this agriculture potential, underutilized land, but also really good rainfall areas, you also come across with some of those provinces. So it makes sense for us to focus there for development, because those jobs in agro-processing, those jobs at a farm level side, can really assist in uplifting the economies of those provinces. And I think that's where, at the start, we really need to be focusing on, while obviously working on the development in other provinces. So certainly those are the provinces that hold the greater potential.
Okay. And I can assume that, based on where those provinces are, that one of the big issues relating to it, and we all know that things work together, nothing works in isolation. And I can just imagine that some of the biggest issues is transport, because if you actually produce the goods, you've got to have a transport system that produces it, not just that moves the produce, but also moves it quick enough. And how does that play out, and how is that part of the solution and the optimism that you have for this industry?
Yeah, I mean, we about, I think 2 weeks ago or so, if I'm not mistaken, we had organized by the presidency this infrastructure summit and all of those things. And one of the key areas or sectors that obviously is part of that is the agricultural sector. It is correct that development in the former homelands provinces in particular is not only hindered by the fact that large portions of those land plots are sitting on with the traditional leaders having some bit of authority over, but also the story of infrastructure. And you can look at it on all kinds of perspective. Either you are dealing with land, with road, or we're dealing with water, or you're dealing with storage like silos and all of those things. The infrastructure that many provinces enjoy, unfortunately, in those provinces, we don't have that type of an infrastructure. So as you are dealing with the land, you will also at the same time have to address the infrastructure constraints in order to get the agricultural sector going forward there. And I do think that now it's much of a better time than 20 years ago. For example, if you needed to store grain 20 years ago, you have to build up big silos. Now you can have silo bags and having some technologies that actually leapfrogs some of the other tough infrastructure constraints you would have had to put in place. But certainly that's an important part of development for those provinces.
Okay. So Wandile, if I was a farmer or I wanted to go in and I decided I'm now tired of coaching and consulting for businesses, I want to go and have a life as a farmer, and maybe I consider the Eastern Cape, maybe not. What sector would you advise me to go in? Where's the biggest opportunity? In other words, excuse the pun, but where's the low-hanging fruit?
Yeah, the low-hanging fruit is in fruits, Jack. On the horticulture space, that's where I would advise anyone, fruit and vegetables, to go into that space. That's where I would advise that one go into, because there's 2 things there. You also have a higher social impact in terms of they are labor intensive. You can be able to get as many people helped and working, but at the same time, those are high value subsectors that could assist a great deal. So I would, and obviously, if those can't work well, you can always get on livestock, because that also depends on the agroecological conditions of the area that one would focus on. But the Eastern Cape, where you say you wouldn't necessarily go, I would even urge people to say Eastern Cape, KZN and Limpopo are the great places to go. Those are the new frontiers for growth. If you're looking at any of the other provinces, you won't be able to get as much gains as in the long run you would get in those provinces, especially with the climate change discussion, which is really severely affecting other provinces.
Excellent. Now, Wandile, on previous Business Book Club interviews, I interviewed a guy by the name of Gigi Alcock. I'm not sure if you've heard of him or know of him.
No. I haven't been able to look up Gigi.
Gigi. Okay, so Gigi is he calls himself the White Zulu. He was brought up on the banks of the Tugela River with his parents. He could speak Zulu before English. A very, very interesting character, but more so a very deep understanding of the Zulu culture specifically, but also of the economy that is going on beyond what we know on a almost want to say on an LSM level, So if you earn a salary, you're part of the economy. If you don't earn a salary, you're almost not deemed to be part of the economy. But there's a whole different economy that is going on there. And through his research, what he's done, one of the items that he brought up was goats and the farming of goats and the amount of potential there is in the farming of goats. We can almost now go into the conversation of exporting goats because it is being used in a cultural sense. There's so many uses for it. What in your mind? What's your view behind the farming of goats specifically? And are you aware of government actually doing anything and supporting this industry and acknowledging it as a so to speak, a low-hanging fruit?
Yeah, two things there. In terms of the goats and its potential, certainly depending on the area in which one is farming at, it's certainly an industry to look at. And I do think that South Africa does pay attention on it. And that's the second point. And even the lawmakers are paying attention on it, in a sense that it is amongst those subsectors that usually you would export to the Middle East. And for those exports to happen, that involved the state having to assist in open up those avenues. Even if you look at the goat meat that goes to the Far East, South Africa participates greatly onto that. So it is supported, it is looked at, but I do think that it is not amongst the key ones that gets to be prioritized at most times, because prioritization goes with about those two things. The value consideration, but also the job consideration, because we're dealing with roughly about those twin challenges nationally, but more so at the local level of higher unemployment and lower economic activity in those rural towns. So anything that could have higher multipliers on those perspectives, that's what from a law perspective, from a lawmaker's perspective, give greater consideration. But certainly, if you look at the southern side of the Eastern Cape, there is a thriving goat industry that is starting to happen there. So certainly it's amongst the important sectors.
Right. So Wandile, there's two things that come to mind as we continue this conversation. And ladies and gentlemen, please feel free at any time to ask us a question. As we've said, we're not going to have a specific question and answer session necessarily. We encourage you to engage with us as we continue this conversation. As questions come up in your mind and you feel Wandile and myself, we need to bring that in, please feel free to do that. We welcome any questions. Wandile, so the one side is that you've actually got to produce stuff. That's one side of the economic equation, is to provide funding for people to do farming. The problem, I guess, with fruit farming is it takes a few years for those trees to actually grow and produce fruit. One could easily have the argument that, with goat farming, you could do that. You could turn around revenues a lot quicker, but it's all about getting the balance correct. But on the one hand, you've got to produce the goods. So you've got to either produce the trees, you've got to farm the cattle or farm the goats. But beyond that, you need somebody to buy it. So you need to support the whole trading mechanism of bringing buyer and seller together. what is happening in that field, and is that part of the conversation that you're interested in?
Yeah, I mean, look, the South African agricultural sector, Jack, is well quite developed and interlinked to the global market and across all of the subsectors. If you look in value terms of what we produce, for example, on an annual basis, we export roughly about 49% of what we produce. Those on average are exports that are worth about 10 billion US dollars on an annual basis. And we have about roughly 40% of the agricultural products that we produce as South Africa going to the African market, particularly the SADC region. Then you have about nearly a third going to the EU market. Then the rest is Asia and the rest of the world. So we are nicely interlinked onto that. But it wasn't always like that. I mean, you look back, for example, say year 2000, our export activity there, even in our share of what we produce going in exports, was relatively low at that time, roughly maybe less than a third. And exports in value terms at the time were around about 2 billion US dollars. So we've grown quite significantly since then. So that discussion and that growth was really also driven, by a number of things. Firstly, this continuous negotiation on opening up these export markets, because that demand management and that demand expansion is always an important consideration when you're doing anything or in agriculture on the production side. And I think the DTI at the time, as well as the colleagues in the industry, have been fundamental on making sure that they are driving and they are opening up as many export markets as we can. And the other important factor, obviously, that has contributed to our growth in South Africa's agriculture sector is technology. By productivity, either you're looking at it from a biological perspective or looking at it a mechanical perspective. So tech as well as trade have been the key fundamental things to the growth that we have enjoyed over time. So the discussion that we are having about growing the sector is really across all of those things, because as much as we are thinking about, say, get the Eastern Cape working, get KZN working, and Limpopo, grow the activity in the South African agricultural sector. You do that, but at the same time, you have to be growing trade. And I think in one of the chapters, for example, in the book, we dedicate a great deal of amount of saying what should be done on trade, what are the new markets we should be focusing on, where we elevate points like really a key focus interest on China, really a key focus interest on India, because as much as we are growing on the production side, if you're not paying attention on trade, while you're already sitting about half of what we produce goes to the outside market, you will have some challenges.
So what are some of the new things that has happened in that market, that the market has actually been opening? I mean, what are some of those changes that have actually taken place that farmers can go? Because this conversation is not just about putting farmers into land that isn't being used or land that is not being properly used. It's also to support current farmers so that they can do more with what they have. But what are the changes that have been put in place that actually supports them and that could make, to pull this back to the conversation that we started with about being optimistic about the future, especially regarding this subject. So what changes have been made that people and our audience could be excited about?
No, I think on the trade one, one of the exciting stuff is the one that I just referred to say our footprint in the global market on having as many trade agreements as we can is quite wide as South Africa. And right now, for example, we recently opened for certain products in China, and now we are looking at India. And the key is to open as much as we can also within the Chinese market. Because one of the challenging things that we will be facing post-COVID-19 is that Africa, where 40% of what we produce is usually going to, is having a situation where you are seeing over 2% decline in per capita GDP in those countries, which means that people will be getting relatively poorer. Therefore, you need to think about the demand patterns of the agricultural product to say, if then that's the case macroeconomically, what will be happening to our demand for products, which is where we are intensifying, at least by we now, meaning on the policymaking side, intensifying the efforts on really looking in those Far East markets where the estimates point that the economic fallout might not be as huge as what you would see, for example, in the African continent. So I think that those are some of the important things. But also I think the other important thing for South Africa is that in as far as technology is concerned, and I make this point in the book, if you look at Africa in general, we're the only country that has embraced technology and new innovations that are coming in. This might sound controversial to some, but it is the fact that in 2001, for example, we're the first country to open up for the genetically modified crops in South African agriculture. And if you look at the productivity at which we have gained since then, and how much in terms of incomes that has given us, all of those new things of flexibility of policy in South Africa is exciting. And obviously the other exciting thing to the starting point is that the most one thing that has made people to be anxious was this one of the land policy. And if we get that right, I do think that we have all of the other fundamentals sitting in place, obviously with the major threat that we'll be sitting with at hand being the story of climate change, which as the world over, we are all still trying to see how are we going to adapt in that environment.
This technology debate is extremely interesting. I know from research that the Australian market is quite high on the technology and the farming space as such. How do we stack up against the Australians when it comes to using technology in our farming practices?
Yeah, I would say, look, South Africa's agricultural sector is quite sophisticated. We stack up, or we are in line with the Australia, Canada, United States. If you walk in a farm in a free state and you look at what's happening there, you're more likely, even if you were to go to Iowa in the farms in there, relatively more similar methods that are actually applied in the farms, because major agricultural entities that are operating in those countries are the same one that we see in South Africa. This is why even in terms of productivity of almost all of the crops, if you were to look at us and you look just north of South Africa in any other African country, there's always that big disparity. Is that South Africa from early on 1994, as we integrated with the world, we had flexibility of attracting some of the multinationals to come in place in South Africa, and some came in to promote their technologies with the hope that they will use us as an avenue to even go on into the African market. But I do think that the other thing that happened is that when those multinationals came in, we're already having this dual system where you had an advanced commercial sector in South Africa's agriculture, but also you have that smallholder farming side. Now, the challenge at which we are living in is to say, as these technologies and productivity happens, how do you uplift those that were left behind and that smallholder farmers where possible, so that they can get as much gains as what you see on the commercial sector? And that's where the state support is usually also needed on leveling up that playing field.
So, thinking about the land reform debate again, are we saying that the farming or the agricultural market is it diversifying or is it decentralizing? So in other words, are we seeing more small farmers coming up and running farms and your big farms being divided? Is that the case?
No, I mean, look, since what happens in South Africa's agricultural sector, you had average size of a farm, for example, around about 700 hectares. Right now, an average size of a farm in South Africa is around about 2,200 hectares. What happened is, before 1994, you obviously had this dispensation, which was giving a guaranteed price for farmers. You had subsidies and all of those things. And under that market conditions, obviously supplying is supported through the fiscus, but it even supports farms that were not per se as productive or couldn't stand the ground. Then fast forward, you get to 1997, 98, where there is what we called the deregulation of South African agricultural markets. What that meant then that we went on a free market conditions. And since that period, we actually started to see consolidation, South African farms relatively getting bigger. And the only thing that made them to be bigger from that average of 700 to 2,200 was to cope with these tough conditions as we integrate to the global market. Competitiveness required the economies of scale. And that's what one sees when they go on into the farms in South Africa.
So how much of what we actually produce stays in our country and goes to export, percentage-wise?
Percentage-wise of what we produce, 50 or 51%, depending on the year. That's what we end up consuming. That's in value terms. For exports, it's about half in certain years, but on average, if you look at the long run data of about, say, 20 years, or I would even shorten it, say, a decade data, you find that about 49% of what we produce, that's what actually ends up going onto the export market. And those export markets, again, being very important now, because as that expansion in sizes of the farm and the output also increases, we actually have a number of farms that are farming for exports. You think of blueberries, for example, about 70% to 80% of what produced goes to export markets. The oranges, about 60%, 70% of what we produce on the citrus side has to go to the export markets. So certain products are really export orientated, but some are somewhat balanced. But overall, we depended on trade in order to sustain the profitability of our agricultural sector.
And how much of that 49% actually goes into the Africa market?
African market remains an important one, which is why I was again making the point that I am worried about the economic fallout that will come out in them. But at the same time, there is also an opportunity with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement that is going to come out, because about 40% of what goes out of South Africa goes to the Africa market. But if you narrow it down on to say where in Africa do those exports go, almost 90% of them are within the SADC countries, with a few exceptions of the countries up north like Nigeria and a few where you would see our products going in there to those countries. Now, with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, we begin to have access to even some of the other markets where we didn't have much of their participation on, which is why I was thinking on the trade side, really exciting opportunities that will be coming out in there. But that doesn't mean that China story I was emphasizing is not going to be important, but also the India story, because India remains also an interesting market, particularly both of those countries for our beef and for our horticulture, and to a certain extent for our wine. Those are some of the markets that we will have to be looking at.
Excellent. So talking about exciting markets, cannabis. Is that a product? I mean, is that just a fad? Do you really think that there's a market in it? Once again, when I had a conversation with Gigi Alcock about the cannabis, I mean, cannabis was, in his book he talks about the Tugela banks being grown quite extensively for it, and having almost legalized it negatively affected the rural people who sell it. Because now the prices come down, and they actually get a lot less for what they could use to sell it. So, what's your take on the cannabis market?
Yeah, okay. To a couple of things here, which again on the cannabis section of the book we go into detail on, and I will comment also, given my responsibilities in various advisory side in government, onto that. Into whether then it is a fad or it is really a serious discussion. It is a serious discussion. In the development master plans that we have now, we have even a subsection which deals with the cannabis. So that is an important consideration. It is an important side of farming on that end. Now, where is South Africa onto the scope? I mean, South Africa remains relatively, we haven't made good progress in here. We talk a lot about the possibilities of what we could achieve, but we haven't done a lot of work on the ground to get that going. Couple of things here. The Judge Zondo's consideration or judgment that came on a few years ago, that obviously decriminalized it for personal use, but it never really set out what should be the regulation and all of those things. Those are the duties that were left for the elected officials to be able to set that out and the departments in place, which is where now the Department of Agriculture, Department of Health, they've already actually put up something on a regulation for public comments out, which is something that people need to look out and comment onto those and narrow it down so that it could be used. And to the point where you were saying that this decriminalization for personal use might have lowered the value for those that sold it in the shadows of the law. Yes, that might be the case, but I think short-term thing. But now what we need to be doing is that as we are developing this market and writing up the regulations, we need to have a much more focused approach relative, for example, say Zimbabwe or Lesotho, where there were these higher licensing fees, which negatively then affected those who have been on that sector. Because if you are giving a license at nearly 100,000, those people that have been there, they don't have that type of money. Then you end up enriching those that have capital, and they get to be dominant on that value chain. So those are sensitivities that we need to have. But you can structure that well and also set up the processing facilities, largely, particularly, again, to those 3 growth frontiers, because we have anecdotal evidence that the Transkei is really at the forefront of the growing of some of these things, if one reads and hears all of these things that are coming up, and even myself being from those areas, when I hear the stories that come out. So there could be potential there, there could be potential in KZN, but I do think that the processing of all of this, either medicinal and also looking at hemp for textile industries, we should have those hubs of processing in those areas and give greater consideration for indigenous farmers that are from those areas that have been doing this when we think about the licensing of it and the writing of the regulations.
So what is the big thing that government has to do to support that industry?
Right now, craft the regulations in a right way, both for the planting of it, but also for the agro-processing side. And I think those also will give signals to the investors that will need to be coming into the sector. Because as we speak of today, that we've been talking about it and being aware of it, and you look at, you look at David Makura's of Gauteng, for example, State of the Nation address, he mentioned it. You look at Minister of Agriculture, she mentions it, Minister of Finance, they mention this. But I think now we need to go back, then the sentiment is right, but writing up those regulations. And I think that they are not sleeping on that job, like I say, in the agricultural master plans, which I'm partially involved in. This process is there, is part of the serious discussion, part of work that the technocrats are giving it greater consideration about how to develop the industry. Excellent.
Now, Wandile, we haven't, I see that we've got a few questions. We probably won't be able to look at all of them, but there's 1 or 2 interesting ones. Well, they're all actually interesting, but let's have a look at this one. How will technology be made available to small farmers that have neither the capital nor sufficient land to be able to finance the technology that will allow them to be competitive and efficient? And that was submitted by Margarida. Thank you, Margarida, for your contribution to this conversation. We appreciate that. Wandile, what is your take on that? How do small farmers get access to technology when they don't have the necessary capital?
Yeah, I mean, when there's no necessary capital, that obviously involves the state involvement. And that's what has been the case throughout since 90. If you look at through the recapitalization story, Mafisa and the various programs that the Department of Agriculture have been putting in place is for assisting farmers into those methods. But now we really need to be, I mean, there is a big drive of saying, let's look at commercialization of black farmers, because no one can live for a longer period on the fiscus. So you need to really supporting people, but supporting them to grow so that they can be able to stand on their own, and then they continue to actually grow. So those are the discussions that are taking place. But I think at the inception space on what Margaret is referring to, the state involvement will need to be there. And this is not going to be a new phenomenon, because if you look back at the history of South Africa, even from 1900, there's been a state involvement supporting farmers up until the 1994. If you look at the data of the subsidies and how these instruments, even Agricultural Credit Board, was very effective on supporting the farmers that are commercial farmers that you see existing in South Africa today, even if not the individuals that are owning this farm, but the sector on its own generally. The bank at its own inception, there was a lot of involvement on supporting that. So anyone who's still at the inception will need that helping hand. But I think in the long run, they need to have a goal of making sure that they are able to be sustainable.
Now, without getting too political or anything, but are we seeing more support from the government in this area? I mean, are they really focusing on the right things in the agricultural sector that they should be focusing on? Saying that, that their support is the one thing, but there's the other question is, are they doing enough? I mean, are they supporting this industry that is so important? And I mean, you obviously a big component in it, and I mean, you're part of Cyril's, inner circle in terms of advising the presidency on this, is enough being done?
I mean, it's difficult, obviously, to put a scale and say enough is being done. But I would say perhaps there is effort that is being done, because I mean, you're looking out in a country, and the people that are running a country, you have a limited resources at a time when you're doing this, and there's always certain trade-offs that are there. And support doesn't always need to come on a monetary basis, but they can be on regulatory basis, they can be on policy basis, on whatever way. So I would say, given that, Jack, you look at the data, for example, 1994 up until 2019 in South Africa, and you index the agricultural output in there, it has more than doubled. If the output has doubled, that means that something right is being done in the sector. Had we seen that trend showing a decline, therefore we would have said that not something good is being done. So on that basis, I would say something good is being done, but there could always be improvement that can be made, which is where I think that these reviews and this interaction that are being done in these plans can contribute to that. And there's a number of mistakes, obviously, throughout those 26 years that have been made, which is why we're and looking at all of these policies, you need to look back and see where have we fallen short. But I would say, looking broadly on a macro perspective, that there's been good progress.
But that's very important data, and thank you for sharing that. I mean, the fact that it's more than doubled the output, I'm not sure what the other relative matrix for that would be to be able to ensure that there's a relativity factor in. But I guess, the fact that it's just, there's an upward trend, and we are producing more substantially, I mean, that is a good news story. And, part of what we need to share, especially here on the Business Book Club, where knowledge is key, and with knowledge, we can actually make a difference. Now, there's another question there from Gail, Wandile, and I just want to read that out, is what is being done to ensure sustainability of soil health? What is your take on that? What is being done to ensure the sustainability of soil health?
Yeah, I mean, in South Africa, as Gail will know, farming is a private matter, is a private business matter. But broadly, which is that farmers decide on their individual businesses on how they take care of their farms and stuff. But what I've seen being meaningfully done on a larger scale is the promotion of conservation agriculture, which Gail will know that it assists on improving soil health. And also the point I was making earlier on to say there's always this fallow land that are left where you would farm certain pieces of land, and then you leave that for in a certain season, you leave it unplanted. It's one of those processes of ensuring the soil health. And that on its own also isn't being done because farmers were very much only concerned about soil health. Yes, they might have been concerned to a certain extent, but I do think that climate change is also forcing us to think creatively about what are some of the means we could actually conserve soil moisture, look at after soil health, because that assists onto that. Because if we're not doing that, and you have this erratic weather conditions that we always see, that hurts the farmer's pocket. So people are getting an incentive or forced by the climate change to actually be able to take these considerations as they run their private farming businesses.
Okay. All right, and then there's another question that we got from Facebook. As we know, we're running live on Facebook as well. And any thoughts or views about hydroponics or aquaponics industry in South Africa, Wandile?
It's starting up, and I think that there is greater potential. You see people in Johannesburg and the other cities really doing some of that farming in close by areas, particularly in a fresh produce side, vegetables. That's where we see a lot of the hydroponics, and so that people can be able to supply those nearby areas. And again, I think that with the urbanization, with the climate change, those are some of the things, and new technology, those are some of the things that you will see growing. And I think over time, the cost of establishing those will somewhat be reduced. And as the cost of establishment is reduced, that's where you will see a good take-up of the hydroponics and the other methods of farming that you see. And that will assist also in the terms that now you won't be needing as much of a bigger plots of land to actually be able to get as much yields that anybody with a relatively bigger plot of land will be able to get yields on that. So I think that's one of those new things that you will see really taking up, not new per se, but new consideration that will be taken up in a large scale in the coming years in South Africa and elsewhere.
Excellent. Now, Wandile, we've almost come to the end of our time together tonight. It's been absolutely amazing talking to you about land reform and about agriculture and common ground. Your final message for the people of South Africa, for our audience, on finding common ground in our country. What would you like to leave everybody with as a final message?
Yeah, a final message, what I would say is that South Africa's agricultural sector is one of the growth areas that we will be looking at. We are now dealing with the pandemic, and after this, we will be on a reconstruction phase. And that reconstruction phase will involve looking at the sectors that will be able to give us growth, and agriculture will be one of those. And that world will also be the world where there's higher levels of unemployment, and this sector is labor intensive. So it will open up opportunities, but not only on a lower end on the farm level, but the value chain will also have opportunities. And those that are on an investment side, this is again an area where investors can look at and see which areas of investments they can actually go into. But also, more important, also components of our population, youth, will also be able to get opportunities to get into this sector. And the policymakers are thinking about those ways of creating those pathways for youth, and also gender diversity. That is so important. And for me, on the book, obviously, Finding Common Ground, we do offer some of the other views about how to go around that. And one can find a book and see what those opportunities are looking like and what's the outlook for the sector probably looks like.
Excellent, Wandile, thank you so much. And if people want to buy your book, which bookstores is it available?
It's available nationwide in all the major bookstores, but also online. You can get it on Kindle and all of the other major platforms on an ebook. You'll be able to find the copy of the book.
So I can go on to Loot or Take a Lot, order it, receive it in a few days, or I can go online through Amazon, order it, or I can just go to my favorite exclusive bookstore or Estel Books, grab a copy and obtain a bit more knowledge about this very, very important subject for our country. Agriculture, finding common ground. It's got some controversy in it, but I think it's very important that we stay abreast of this subject, that we support this industry in so many ways as we can, and that we as a collective also remain positive, because with guys like Wandile supporting this, we could only go from strength to strength, supporting our president, supporting our country, and making sure that there's a better future for all of us. Wandile, thank you very much for your contribution. Thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. That's what the Business Book Club is about. It's really about sharing knowledge. And as you might know or might not know, everybody out there is, how we survive. We are a non-profit organization. We are a Section 18A registered organization. Our existence depends on two things. It depends on sponsorships, and it depends on books. Because what we do is we take the books that people donate to us, and we give those to libraries in a less privileged area. Up to date, we've received more than 7,000 books. We are constantly looking for libraries to support. So if anybody knows of a library that's in need of books, we've got a few in store, which would be glad to donate, because books are literally knowledge. And sharing that knowledge gives people access to a different way of thinking, exactly what Wandile has done tonight. He has shared with us his stuff. He shared with us a different way of thinking about the agricultural sector. He shared with us new knowledge, and that is inspiring. And hopefully that inspiration can lead to different behavior. And that's what our books are doing. When they go into these libraries, they inspire and they drive people to give them the opportunity to change behavior and to do things differently. So what we'll do is after the event, we'll share an email in the next day or two. There will be a link. If you want to donate any books, please contact us. More than welcome to drop it off at our offices in Northcott 4 ways. Alternatively, we can make some other arrangements and make South Africa a better place through sharing of knowledge. That is really what all of this is about. So thank you very much for attending. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for spending the time. We really appreciate that. Share the word of knowledge. Share the link of the Business Book Club. That is our objective, is to share knowledge through a country that is very much needed. And once again, Wandile, you have been absolutely excellent. You've shared with us your knowledge, and we are extremely grateful for that. Thank you so much. Have a blessed evening. And to everybody out there, have a blessed evening. Thank you so much for supporting us. And we look forward to seeing you again in a month's time. The first Tuesday of every month. Remember, the first Tuesday of every month at 7 o'clock. We'll be live on Facebook. Or otherwise, just make sure that we've got your email address and we'll send you the link. And with that, over and out. And thank you so much.